baseball sword. Cracked out a home run, shout a hip hooray! Cheer for the Minnesota Twins today.
Welcome to Aimless TV. I'm your host, Richard A. Claddy. I've got a special guest tonight, Bob Showers. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And this is part 2 of the Twins at the Met. Bob Showers has written this book. Now, I understand you got exclusive right to some pictures, and that's where we kind of ended part 1. We're just getting into the story these pictures told.
Yeah, I was able to get access to all the Twins photos, so what I wanted to do was use the photos in my interviews with Harmon and Rod and Jim Cott, Tony O, and let those photos evoke the memories, as opposed to me just asking these guys the same questions that they get asked in so many interviews.
Sure.
And specifically the headshots of all of the players, I wanted them to go through and just see.
And now there's a lot of headshots of all the Twins players that played throughout at the Met Stadium.
Played at the Met era, 61 until 81. Those years the Twins were at the Met. So it came to about 263 different ball players in that
And there's
era.
a lot of forgotten names
That's
or
right.
people that maybe didn't even hear of before.
Yeah, and that's what was fun about having the guys go through and look at those photos and let those faces jog the memories, as opposed to just saying, tell me a story about, Danny Goodwin, tell me a story about Danny Ford, but seeing the faces and having that be the impetus for the memories to come flooding back. And it wasn't just the big name players who had the stories.
Sure.
You never knew even an insignificant player might have been attached to a
crazy
fun story. And that happened when I was interviewing Roy Smalley, our shortstop back in the Met Stadium era. Roy was going through those photos and having so much fun reminiscing. And he came upon a photo of a little used shortstop that we had in the 1970s, Sam Perlazzo. Now, Sam Perlazzo has gone on to a post-baseball career. He was manager for the Orioles for a number of years. He was a coach for the Phillies, and he's currently a minor league instructor with the Twins. So Sammy has stayed in baseball, but at the time he was just kind of a farmhand with the Twins.
Okay.
But Roy saw this picture of Sammy Perlazzo, and he says, my gosh, Sammy Perlazzo. He says, I think one of the greatest stories I remember from Twins history involves Sammy Perlazzo. And he says, it never gets told. And Roy said, in fact, I'd forgotten it for so many years until seeing this photo. But Roy went on to say it was the last game of the season in 1977. He said the Twins were playing on the road at Milwaukee in County Stadium. He said the Twins, we were out of contention. The Brewers were out of contention. So on this Sunday afternoon, last game of the season, the game meant nothing. So Sammy Perlazzo had been a September call-up. So we know that in September, teams are allowed to call players up from the minor leagues just to give the guys a taste for being on the big league squad and give them a feel for being in the dugout. Well, Sammy was one of the September call-ups late in 77. So here it is, the last game of the season, and Gene Mauch, the Twins manager, decides to let Sammy play shortstop that day. Well, going into that game, Rod Carew had 99 runs batted in, and that was the great season that Rod had when he flirted with hitting 400.
Sure.
He went into that last game of the season, Rod did, with 99 runs batted in. And Roy, as he was telling his story, said, we all knew how much it would mean to Rod to get 100 runs batted in. He had never hit that milestone, that threshold before.
Right.
But Rod wouldn't say anything about it. He said, but we knew it meant a lot to Rod. So Roy said it was the 8th inning of the game, and Sammy Perlazzo in the top of the 8th is set to lead off for the Twins, and Rod is scheduled to hit behind him. So as Sammy is in the on-deck circle, ready to go up and hit, Gene Mauch, the manager, yells at Sammy and says, Perlazzo, come here. He says, you go up there right now and hit a triple. Do you understand? This is bad. You go hit a triple. Roy says, Sammy Perlazzo turned as white as a ghost. He said, he's this rookie minor league call-up. He's already scared to death of crusty old Gene Mauch, and now Gene Mauch has just ordered him to go up and hit a triple. Toughest thing to do as a batter, to hit a triple. So he said, Perlazzo just kind of numbingly nodded his head and started to make his way toward the plate when Mauch said, come here, come back here. He said, this pitcher for the Brewers, and it was old Bill Travers. You might remember the ace for the Brewers, Bill Travers. He said, he likes to throw a split-fingered pitch. We've noticed when he'll grip that, his glove will flap open just a little bit.
Wow.
He said, so if that glove doesn't flap on the first pitch, he's going to start you out with a fastball. You hit that fastball for a triple. Roy says, Perlazo goes up to the plate. First pitch, line shot down into the left field corner. Perlazo hustles all the way around to third. Perlazo hits a triple. Next at bat, Rod comes up, solid base hit up the middle. Perlazo scores. Rod finishes the season with 100 runs batted in, the only time in Rod's career that he drove in 100 runs, all because of Sammy Perlazo going up on demand from Muck and hitting that triple. So it was a kick to hear that story, certainly. Well, I interviewed Rod a second time after hearing that story. Rod met with me twice. He was so meticulous in going through those headshots that upon the end of our first meeting, he was only halfway through. So when I met with Rod a second time, he hadn't yet got to Sam Perlazo's photo, so I couldn't wait to see Rod's reaction, and I didn't let on that I knew this story.
Sure.
So sure enough, Rod's making his way through the headshots. He gets to the photo of Sam Perlazo, and Rod just gets this warm smile on his face, and his shoulders kind of slumped a little. He goes, Sammy Perlazo. He says, you know what? Last game of the season in '77, I had 99 runs batted in. Gene Mauch ordered Sam to hit a triple so I might be able to knock him in to get 100 RBIs.
Right.
And he said he did it. He actually did it. And Rod said, after that game, I told Sammy I'd take him out to dinner, and looking at this photo of him now, I realize I haven't done that yet. So Rod said, I think I owe Sammy a dinner along the way.
Well, yeah, I've been great memories, but sometimes I suppose when they saw some of those pictures, you might get conflicting reactions.
Yes, good point. A good story involves Rod with that as well.
Oh, really?
Rod and Harmon told two different versions of the same story.
Sure.
I interviewed Harmon on a Friday afternoon, and he comes to a photo of small-time reliever we had named Steve Barber. Mm-hmm. And Harmon sees this photo, and Harmon says, oh, Steve Barber. He says, he just about took my head off in an exhibition game one time. He said, Steve Barber was pitching for our minor league team in Tacoma. Mm-hmm. He said, we were out on the West Coast and went up to had an exhibition game against our Tacoma team. And he threw one high and tight. Harmon says, I had to duck out of the way. I thought I was a goner. You know, Harmon, just such a gregarious, wonderful man. Harmon said, yeah, you know, the lights in that old minor league ballpark weren't so good. I think I had a little trouble picking up that ball. So, okay. Cute story. Mm-hmm. The next day I interviewed Rod.
Right.
Rod's coming through. Rod gets to the picture of Steve Barber. Rod just grits his teeth. He says, Steve Barber. He threw a pitch at Harmon's head. He says, boy, was I ticked. He said, even though Steve Barber was in our organization, I charged the mound from the dugout. Rod's version was Steve Barber was the last pitcher cut in spring training, and this exhibition game took place 2 weeks after spring training ended. Rod felt that was Steve Barber's way of trying to get back at the Twins, throwing a pitch at Harmon's head and knocking Harmon down. Wow. So here you have the two conflicting versions of that. Now, when I interviewed Harmon and Harmon went through those headshots and talked about players, the first thing Harmon would say fell into one of three categories. It was either, oh, he was a good guy, or he was a really good guy, or he was a great guy. So Harmon looked upon everybody in the highest positive way. So I tend to feel that maybe Rod's version of that story was closer to the truth, that maybe Barber had a little vindictive streak in him and thought, hey, I'll send my own little message to the team this way.
Sure. Well, what was amazing about the Twins at the time, I mean, these players, nothing like today's contracts. I mean, if you're a left-handed specialist and you can get one guy out, you're making, $5 million or some crazy deal. You might pitch to one guy. Back then, you had a relief pitcher, they'd come in like at the 7th inning or something, or 8th inning. There was no specialists.
No, closers came in like the 7th. There was one year we had Bill Campbell. He won 16 games, and he also had 38, 40 saves, but that's because he was coming in the 7th inning, a save back then.
It was nothing to throw 200 pitches a year or something. Now, we can't do that. No.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the contracts, too, because when the guys got to the photos of Cal Griffith, the Twins' old owner back then, they told funny stories about how Calvin would sit up in the press box and keep his own stats, even though the team had stats that they would have. Calvin was very meticulous in keeping his own, and then he would use those stats the next year when he had you sign the contract. And this was the days before free agency and things like that. You couldn't just say yes or no to a contract offer and think you could sign with somebody else.
No.
You were with that team, and so they'd say once a year in December, you'd get called into Mr. Griffith's office, and he would push the contract across the desk to you, and you either signed it or you didn't play. You couldn't refuse to sign it and think, I'll latch on with the White Sox or the Indians or somebody. You either played or you didn't.
And Calvin was pretty tight with the buck.
Yeah, and he would use those stats that he kept when he determined what he was going to pay you that next year. And so he might say, you came to the plate last year 10 times with a runner on second and nobody out. But on 3 of those times, you failed to advance the runner to the third base, so I'm going to hold back $50 for each of those times that you did that. And Rod Carew told the story about being outside Calvin's office, waiting for his time to go in and meet with Mr. Griffith on the contract. And Jerry Terrell, who was a utility infielder that we had back then, went in for his meeting with Cal Griffith. And Rod says, Jerry Terrell was feeling pretty confident that he'd had a good season the year before and that he was going to get a raise, especially because he had just had a young child. He and his wife had their first child, so he thought I was going to get a raise, Jerry Terrell did. Rod says about 20 minutes, Jerry Terrell came out of his meeting in tears because not only did he not get the raise, but Calvin Griffith docked him from the previous year's salary. So that was
Bert Blyleven tells a similar story where he had a pretty good year. He's going in there and Calvin gives him all this crap and he was going to get docked. He was looking for a big raise and he's going to end up with less money. And he said, and then he demanded a trade. That's what we lost. Blyleven. He demanded a trade after that.
Yeah, that was just when free agency was coming in, and at that point, Cal Griffith knew that I'm not going to be able to re-sign him. He's going to leave. And he's gonna be due some big money, and I'm not going to pay that big money. So that's when they traded him to Texas for Royce Smalley, Mike Cubbage, and a few other guys that kind of drifted through the program. And that's what really hurt the Twins team in the mid and late 70s. We had a really solid ball club with Lyman Bostock and Larry Heisel and Rod and
Calvin just wouldn't pay him.
Bill Campbell and guys like that. But yeah, Calvin wasn't going to pay. Free agency came, so the team got gutted. Heisel went to Milwaukee, Bostock went out to California, Bill Campbell went to the Red Sox, and ultimately that's what led to Rodney being traded out to the Angels for Ron Jackson and such, Kenny Landreau, because there was no way Rod was going to re-sign with the Twins when he knew he could get big money elsewhere.
The Twins had a lot of success. we had teams in the early playoff system. I remember Billy Martin was the coach back then. And it was kind of, for Calvin, there's the pros and cons about Calvin. You could tell stories, but let's face it, he was a baseball man. He knew baseball.
Yeah.
And he produced a great product, but then he just couldn't understand the modern player, I don't know, or he didn't understand the economics, the changing times, and we ended up losing these very, very outstanding players.
Yeah, he was looked upon as the dinosaur, one of the last of the family-owned franchises, and so there just wasn't the money there that other teams had, other teams to spend, and
even Harmon Killebrew ended up his career with the Kansas City Royals.
Yeah. Calvin wanted Harmon to retire after Harmon's last season with the Twins, which was 1973, and offered Harmon the opportunity to either be a first base coach with the Twins or to be the manager of the AAA affiliate out in Tacoma. And that was right when Frank Quillisi was let go as manager. Harmon wanted to be the manager of the team.
Wow.
Cal Griffith didn't want to hire somebody that didn't have previous managerial experience, and that's when Calvin hired Gene Mauch to come in. So, but you're right, we had that solid team in the late 60s. Unfortunately, we went up against the Orioles, which were a powerhouse then. In the early 70s, we had a strong team, but we went up against the Oakland A's, who were winning championships.
Right.
And then in the later 70s, we went up against the Kansas City Royals, who were a strong team coming on then with Amos Otis and George Brett and Darrell Porter and Frank White and Larry Gura. So the timing wasn't right for the Twins because there were all these other dynasties there, and then we were losing the players, whereas other teams were hanging on to theirs.
But there was a lot of great baseball played there. A lot of great baseball, a lot of great teams, and
great characters that were out there.
Oh, heck yeah.
It was funny when I would do the interviews and guys got to the photo of the old broadcaster Halsey Hall.
Yeah,
And
Halsey
you
Hall.
remember Halsey Hall
He was an
so well.
institution here in Minnesota.
So whereby the Steve Barber incident, you'd get different versions of the same story. What was interesting with Halsey Hall is his photos would generate the same response over and over again. The guys would say, when talking to Halsey Hall, you never wanted to get too close because he had the worst breath of anybody. Those were the first things that I would hear from each guy. They'd say Halsey Hall had the worst breath.
Because he's always smoking cigars.
Well, it was followed with because he loved to eat raw onions. So here would come story after story from Harmon, from Frank Quillisi, from Jim Rance, the director of minor leagues. All these guys had their own Halsey Hall onion story. Frank Quillisi said Halsey Hall would walk around and eat a yellow onion like it was an apple, a raw onion. And Jim Cott said that back in the 60s, the Twins had their own charter. It was an old United DC-6, and he said it had one of those round horseshoe lounge areas in the back of the plane. And Jim said once we would get up in the air, Jim said myself and Bill Tuttle and Bob Allison and Ray Scott, the announcer, he said we like to go to the back of the plane and play bridge. He said, well, it never failed. We'd be back there about 10 minutes into our bridge game, and we'd look down the aisle of the airplane, and here would come Halsey Hall, making his way back. He said, because Halsey Hall didn't like to fly, and he always felt more comfortable sitting back there than in his seat. Sure. And he said, always hanging from the belt loop on Halsey Hall's trousers were a mesh bag from the supermarket filled with onions. And Jim Cott said we would cringe when we'd see Halsey making the way back because he would start popping in little pearl onions, and then he had a sack of what Halsey Hall called his medicine, but it was just a flask of Jim Beam bourbon.
Yeah,
So
I heard Halsey enjoyed a drink.
Yeah, so he'd sit back there, eat his onions, wash them down with the bourbon, and then have the cigars. So they said it was just terrible having to deal with Halsey Hall with his breath. Charlie Walters, who's a wonderful longtime sports writer at the Pioneer Press, was a member of the Twins in 1969. He had gone to the Twins tryout camp that they still hold to this day to give, recent high school grads and local kids and college kids a chance just to get out on the big league field and let the Twins scouting staff kind of check them out. Yeah, very few players are signed to a contract through those tryout camps. But Charlie did get a $500 contract from going to the camp in 1969. He was a high school kid in Minneapolis. So Charlie went to the tryout camp in 65, correct myself, got the $500 contract, and he made the team in 69 coming out of spring training. So he had moved through the minor leagues for a number of years, made the club in 1969. He was a big, tall, lanky pitcher, threw the fastball, and he told a story about what a thrill it was when Billy Martin came up to him at the end of training camp in 1969 and told him, "You're part of the team." He said he was so thrilled. Now this team that he had grown up loving and idolizing, players like Allison and Camilo Pascual and Tonio, now he was going to be a member of the Twins. And he talked about what a thrill it was when he got on the airplane for the first road trip because the team had left spring training, come back to the Twin Cities for a welcome luncheon, and then they were starting their road trip down in Kansas City to begin the season. And he said he was so thrilled now he's getting on the airplane with all of these guys who were his heroes. And as he gets on the plane and is walking down the aisle, he sees Halsey Hall, and he's thinking, boy, there's Halsey Hall, the guy I've been listening to all these years. And there's an empty seat on the plane next to Halsey Hall, and some of the players told him he can sit next to Halsey Hall.
He's in for a surprise.
So he was so thrilled to sit next to Halsey Hall. Charlie said, boy, 5 minutes after I sat down, I realized why that seat was empty. Said Halsey Hall opened up his briefcase and pulled out some scallions, some long onions, and just started chomping away on him, and then out came the flask. And Charlie said that 2-hour flight to Kansas City was the longest 2 hours that he'd ever spent.
No doubt. And you also mentioned Ray Scott. He's a Hall of Fame announcer. I mean, we had some great talent following these games. I mean, announcing.
Yeah, it was fun for us fans to get to hear those great voices calling the games. And I was growing up back then in Waterloo, Iowa, kind of on the outskirts of town, and there was a radio station out of Des Moines that had a very strong signal that picked up the Twins games, so I was able to listen to Herb Carneal.
Oh, right.
And it would just come through as clear as a bell to hear those games and Herb Carneal's wonderful voice. And Kent Herbeck made the comment that you always knew school was just about ready to be out when you started hearing Herb Carneal's voice. Right. When baseball season started in mid-April, Kent said, growing up in Bloomington like he did, that his mom always had a transistor radio on when she was, hanging clothes on the clothesline in the backyard or in the kitchen,
right,
cooking dinner. Always had the transistor radio on and Herb Carneal's voice. So I always got a kick and could identify with Kent's comment about how you knew school was close to being out when you started hearing Herb Carneal's voice.
Talking about hearing baseball games, this goes back to Halsey Hall. I was at a park and some kid yelled at me. I turned around, he hit me right in the eye with an apple. I mean, from about 10 feet, line drive right into my eyeball. So I had a blood clot, and I was like, 7, 8 years old, and I was in the hospital for a week, and I couldn't move, and they had to cover the other eye so the blood clot wouldn't go to the head and kill me, or put the stress on the other eye, too. So here I am, 7, 8 years old, sitting in how antsy I must have been. So I'm sitting in this hospital for a week, and all I could do was listen to, the only thing I remember is listening to baseball games every night.
Yeah.
It got me through it, basically.
Yeah. Well, those guys did such a great job of
yeah,
painting a picture and not just the things with the game, but the way they would describe the surroundings. Sure. And what kind of night it was and things like that, and just the fun things that went on aside from the game and the sounds that you would hear in the background.
There's other unique things that happened at that stadium. I mean, wasn't there like a bomb scare?
Well, that was a bit of folklore attached to the stadium that nowadays information on the internet is so easy to find, but for so many years there were stories that floated around surrounding the stadium that you didn't know if they were true or not, or what level of truth that there were. And so, story about a bomb scare that I wanted once and for all. Let's get this story chronicled and preserved. And sure enough, there was a bomb scare at the ballpark. This was August 25th, 1970, and it was one of the years that the Twins made it to the playoffs. So they had a Saturday night game against the Red Sox. Pretty good crowd out there because the Twins were in contention. There were about 30,000 people. And I interviewed the Twins' longtime public relations director, Tom Mee is the gentleman's name. Tom has passed away about a year ago, but just a wonderful man. And you talk about a wealth of knowledge. But I went to Tom. I said, once and for all, what happened on that night? And he said it was about the 4th inning of the game. He's up in the press box, and he gets a call from the Bloomington Police Department. Mm-hmm. They inform him that they have just received a call at the police station. Somebody just called and said that they had gone out to the ballpark earlier that morning and placed a bomb somewhere, and that bomb is going to go off during the game. So this is the first time that anybody had been faced with something like this.
Yeah.
The Twins certainly hadn't ever been faced with this kind of dilemma, nor had the Bloomington Police Department. And this is now getting to a period of time in America of social unrest and Vietnam War, protests and things like that. So there were bomb scares that were going on throughout the country at the time, but certainly nothing to this level at Metropolitan Stadium during a Twins game. So Tom said he asked the police department, what do you want us to do? Mm-hmm. And they said, well, we have to get everybody out of the ballpark as quickly as possible, and if we try to do it by normal means, as if the game had just ended and everybody going out to the parking lot, it'll take forever. So you have to instruct everybody on the upper level to leave through those switchback ramps that were on the exterior of the ballpark. Remember those ramps that were kind of cantilevered? And then everybody in the lower level has to move down and onto the field. So that's how we'll get everybody out in orderly fashion so we can see and see, bring in some dogs and try to sniff out this bomb. So I interviewed Tom, and I interviewed Frank Quillisi, Antonio Oliva, and they all had the same memory of the Twins' crusty old public address announcer, Bob Casey.
Right.
And it was put to him to get everyone out in early fashion, and how Bob Casey got on the microphone and said, ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience, but we've just received a call. and somewhere in the stadium is a bomb. And how he screamed the word bomb.
Wow.
It just rattled everybody. So sure enough, folks in the upper deck making their way out, folks in the lower deck making their way onto the field. And Frank Quillis, he said, I was standing next to the Twins dugout as people were filing their way down onto the field. And he said, suddenly I noticed there was a woman who went into a panic. He said she threw herself down on the concrete area by the box seats, and she wrapped her arms around a wrought iron boxy chair, and he said she wasn't moving.
Whoa.
She wasn't moving. And her husband is standing there imploring her to get up because he's worried about her, number one, but they're holding up the long line of people trying to get down onto the field.
Yes.
So Frank says, I looked up to the man and I said, knock her out. Knock her out. Getting hit by you won't be as bad as that bomb. So Frank says, sure enough, this gentleman reared back and boom, jacked his wife across the jaw, and she threw her arms open, and Frank said the gentleman, with the help of a couple other guys, were able to pick this woman up, and she's flailing, and they bring her down onto the field. Well, they get everybody down on the field. Bloomington police came in. Tom Mee said that the police had 2 dogs, and they weren't into the stadium more than 15 minutes before they determined no bomb. Everybody back in and on with the game.
Yeah.
So
Crazy.
Twins wound up losing 2-1. Little Tony Conigliaro hit a home run in the 8th inning, and the Twins lost that game. But I was chatting with the current chief of police in Bloomington, a gentleman named Jeff Potts, a year or so back, and we were talking about this story. And this all came after the book was published, so I wasn't able to get this part in the book. But he said that story has been floating around the Bloomington Police Department for years, and he confided in me that, number one, somehow, he didn't say how, but they knew that bomb scare was a hoax.
Okay.
He said, but once the call was placed to us, we had a duty to call the Twins.
No doubt.
But he said those weren't bomb-sniffing dogs. He said there was a member of the Bloomington Police Department that lived right across Cedar Avenue from the stadium, and they knew that this guy had a couple of hunting dogs. So they called up old Earl Perkins and said, Earl,
We need some dogs.
can you put your uniform on and go across Cedar Avenue to the ballpark and just make it look like the dogs are sniffing for bombs? Because
Those were different times.
So different times. If somebody calls Target Field right now with a bomb scare, there's going to be black helicopters.
heck
It's going
The
to be
FBI.
the city's going to be in lockdown. I mean, all kinds of carrying on. But that was the bit of the folklore. The bomb scare.
Well, hey, there's so
did
many
happen.
great stories. It's amazing how fast this half hour goes by. Once again, Bob Showers has written this book, The Twins at the Met. Now, I understand you can get this on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been out for a couple years, but you can still find it at Amazon.com. My publisher, distributor has a website, itascabook.com, and it all ended for the Twins out there on September 30th, 1981. A 5-2 loss for the Royals. That was the last Twins game at the Met. The Vikings.
Then they built
a few months
dome.
later, and then they built the dome. But
I believe you have a book on the dome. Is
that too.
correct?
But for the Twins in that day, it was a Wednesday afternoon in late September. It was a rainy day. Late September meant kids were back in school. Twins lost 5-2. Last at bat was Roy Smalley, a fly out to short left field, and the attendance was only 15,900. So.
That was the end of the Met. And then I believe it took a few years to tear down, and then...
Yeah, the building sat out there once they moved to the dome. Sat out there just kind of wasting away and rusting away, the field going to seed, and it wasn't until 3 years later that they began actual demolition to make way for Mall of America.
How about that? Well, Bob Showers, I want to thank you once again for coming.
Thank you.
Great book, great pictures.
Oh, my pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Once again, I'm Richard A. Claddy for Aimless TV. We'll be back with another show at the Dome.
When the Senators stopped playing ball, the Twin Cities got the call. Minnesota joined the American League. With Mealy at the reins, the Twins made instant gains. In '65, they had the flag and an MVP. I'm talking baseball. Allison and Perry Twins. Baseball. Kitty Cott and Jerry. Don Mincher and Mudcat coming through. Jimmy Hall and Davy Boswell too, just like Tony. the Killer and Carew.